a great way to look at Wickford. And you know, the reality is, without the harbor, Wickford wouldn't exist. I mean, it began as a money-making scheme by the Updike family in 1709. They had this great parcel of land, you know. Essentially, the Updikes centered at Smith's Castle owned 27 square miles of land in the 1700s. And they had this little place down here. Mostly, at that point, they were involved with the Main Street area, the old Wickford section. The Native Americans had a perfect name for that area. They called it Kayak, which I make every high school and middle school student say because it's fun, which means high place almost completely surrounded by water, which is a very apt description of what old Wickford is all about. If you walk the shorelines of Wickford, you see that it fits perfectly. Updike saw the land that he had after the King Philip's War, and he also was smart. He knew that there were things going on in the East Bay where the shipbuilding industry was centered at that time from the beginning of the 1600s when folks started settling there until that time frame. But what he also knew is they hadn't done a very good job of managing their resources. By the time 1709 came around, almost all of the trees on Aquidneck Island were cut down. There was no more easy, accessible lumber to build ships from, or houses, or even firewood. And Updike realized that he and his Narragansett planter brethren, which were a group of 13 or 14 families that were given control of all of what we now call South County. And think about the reality of that. 14 families owning all of South County. And these people all had plantations of similar sizes to the Updikes, but they had vast, vast acreage of perfect trees for lumber. Updike realized that this island with its natural deep flushing port was a perfect place to set up a shop for shipbuilders. So like a good land developer, he hired a surveyor, he surveyed Wickford out, he put in some rudimentary roads, and he started marketing it in 1709. And he was correct. By 1710, 2 shipbuilders had come to the end of Pleasant Street, and by 1750, there were 5 shipbuilders in and around Wickford itself making sailing vessels, taking advantage of the natural flushing deepwater port. It was easy to work here, and taking advantage of the vast resources that were available here on the West Bay. The village came afterwards. He had all these lots sold off and platted out for houses, but they didn't start building houses until the shipbuilding industry really took off. And then you have a whole village that follows behind it. So the harbor is what Wickford began with. It has sustained Wickford throughout the years. We'll talk about shipbuilding on our tour. I've done research, and the only records I have begin at the end of the Revolutionary War, when shipbuilding began in 1710, and go up to the Civil War, when shipbuilding ended here in Wickford. And I've already identified more than 150 ships that were constructed in Wickford Harbor in that time frame. From little cat boats all the way up to giant 125-foot 3- and 4-masted ships and schooners. So this was a busy, active place, and everything about it was about shipbuilding and the maritime trade. And we'll talk a lot about that as we go out today. We're going to stop a few places along the way. We'll try to cluster together. I'll use my big voice, and we'll hope you can all hear me. And we're going to stop out here first and talk about this, which is South Cove. A few stories about South Cove and the Hussey Bridge. We'll go under the Hussey Bridge, and then we'll stop again opposite the Brown Street parking lot and talk about the shipbuilding industry that existed there, which was the largest shipbuilders in the village. Then we'll go down to the end of Main Street, stop there, and talk about the changes that occurred in Wickford in the 1800s, and then we'll go around the cove and stop opposite the Wickford Yacht Club, talk about Cornelius Island, Rabbit Island, and what happened at the end of Pleasant Street, and then we'll head back and enjoy ourselves. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me, and hopefully we'll make good time, but I'm really looking forward to it. We'll try to, if you have questions, shout them out to me. I'll try to answer them. Hopefully the narrative will answer all your questions, but don't be bashful. If you have a specific question, feel free to yell it out, and we'll do our best to answer it. So let's load them up.
Sounds great.
Okay, everybody, this area has historically been called South Cove in Wickford. And one of the things that features about South Cove that I think is intriguing and carries throughout Wickford Harbor is how much man has changed the natural world to suit our needs. we look behind us and we see this long jetty. That was built in 1899, along with the other jetty which cuts across Academy Cove by the Wickford Elementary School. You can just see the roof of over there. Now these jetties were put in 1899 as American as it could be, an entrepreneurial venture paid for by the folks who were running all the casinos and hotels at the Narragansett Pier. They had seen that there was an enormous immigrant group in the northern part of the state, Providence, Warwick, Cranston, and even going into southeastern Massachusetts, that were finally having jobs where they had this new American thing, free time. Before that, people just worked all the time. They had no free time, and entrepreneurs at that time frame were taking advantage of that. People had a little bit of spending money and they had free time. There was already in existence a huge trolley system that ran all across Rhode Island, southeastern Massachusetts, and even into Connecticut a little ways, that was all interconnected. The southernmost terminus of that was in East Greenwich. It was called the United Electric Railway, and it ended in East Greenwich. The folks who decided that they would take advantage of all of those people that were working all of those factories in the big cities started their own company called the Seaview Trolley Line. And they hooked up and made an arrangement with the United Electric Railway to build a station in East Greenwich near the United Electric Railway station and haul people down to Narragansett Pier so they could have their fun times at the beach in Narragansett, stay at the hotels, play tennis and lawn polo and all the kinds of things that they were doing down there, drink and be merry, have picnics, and get down there to Narragansett cheap. You could go from East Greenwich and be at the Narragansett Pier with 22 stops and still be there in an hour. And it would have cost you 50 cents. It was a great deal. And in order to get down to Narragansett, their biggest issues were crossing Wickford Harbor in these two locations. So they built these two jetties, this one here and the one that's all the way by Wickford Elementary School, to get the trolley cars across. If we were sitting here now in 1910, we would see a trolley probably coming by here every 15 minutes, going across the bridge that used to exist here and heading on its way down to Narragansett. Another feature that we see in this cove is all these concrete pilings you see over here. And if you've been in Wickford a long time, you realize that that was the 120-foot tall WKFD radio station tower. And all of these other concrete pilings along were anchors that held that tower up. Underneath us now is still to this day a network of copper wire grid that was grounding for the tower. It's in the mud at this point. The blizzard of '78, the tower came down and fell in the cove here, and it took a lot of legal wrangling in order to get the owners of this station, which then went bankrupt, to get the radio tower, radio mast out of the harbor and haul it away. And if we look back as we go along, then we see the Hussey Bridge. Now, the Hussey Bridge is the third bridge in that location. The first bridge was built in 1843 by four businessmen in Wickford who had ideas of why they wanted it. They wanted to be able to develop the land down Boston Neck Road. Prior to there being a bridge there, if you wanted to get down there, you would have had to go up Phillip Street, down Post Road, back down Anaquatucket Road, back down Boston Neck Road to get here. Took forever, especially in a day before cars. So the first bridge was built in 1843 by these four men. Judge Pittman, who was a rich wealthy Providence judge who had a house at Duck Cove Farm, and three investors who were interested in marketing the land in Boston Neck. They built the bridge and turned it over to the town, and the town took care of it. Okay, so as I said, this bridge was built in 1843 by these four gentlemen. Three of them were investors who wanted to develop the land out there, including the land up on Prospect Avenue, which didn't even exist at that time. So they helped pay for the bridge. It was turned over to the town of North Kingstown in 1849. And it went fine until the age of the automobile, and of course the wooden bridge was just not adequate. It was constructed for horse and buggies and not automobiles, and it was quickly replaced by an iron bridge, which was brought down here like an erector set and set up across the same location. That bridge only lasted 15 years in typical erector set fashion, and then in the 1900, the state came down and put the concrete bridge that we see there today, and it's been there ever since. It was named after Clarence Hussey, who was the state's first bridge engineer, and he died during the construction of the bridge, so they honored him with that. And ultimately, shipbuilding still occurred even in this cove. The Smith brothers, who lived all the way on the other side of the trolley trestle line there, were building fishing boats. They had a very specific way to get these fishing boats out when they were done. They would have to float them through this location at high tide, wait here in this harbor until low tide, fill the ships with rock so they would be almost to the gunwale, and then go under the bridge at low tide so they could get through, then pull the rocks out on the other side of the harbor, and then they would sell their fishing boats. So Wickford, and this is in the 1910 period time frame, even in 1910, people are building ships way on those inner coves and finding a way to get them out and market them. So we're going to head through the bridge now and stop across from the parking lot and talk about the biggest shipbuilding industry that existed here at Wickford. Okay, if you look over to the Wickford side of you can see from the back of what used to be the Wilson's building all the way down to the Hussey Bridge, all of that land was owned by the largest shipbuilding industry in Wickford, which began in the 1820s. It was called C&B Spink Shipyard. The C and the B were Christopher and Boone Spink, some of the earliest settlers in this part of Wickford, and they opened up the biggest shipyard that made the biggest ships in Wickford at the time. This is where the ships that were 120 foot long or 100 foot long or 90 foot long, 350, 400 tonnage were built out in this location. They subbed out work to some of the other smaller shipyards. Shipyards up in Academy Cove would make hulls for them and float them down here to C&B Spink Shipyard, where they're outfitted, and literally dozens and dozens of enormous sailing vessels were created here at this very dock in Wickford Harbor. Boats that were sold off to people who were running their ships out of New York City, Boston, Providence, and Newport all came down to C&B Spink Shipyard to purchase boats and have them constructed here. We're blessed to have Franklin Roosevelt, who hired everybody in the world who was a secretary during the Great Depression and had hired them as part of the WPA project to type up all of the handwritten records of the custom ports of New England. And all of the records that I have been able to ascertain about Wickford, for a while it was its own custom port, but for the most time it was tied to Newport. And all the records about ships built here and that sailed out of here came from those records. The records prior to the Revolutionary War were destroyed by the British when they were angry about being kicked out of Newport. We have a full set of records from the end of the Revolution to the beginning of the Civil War that details how incredible the shipbuilding industry was here in Wickford. Beyond the 150 ships I found that were built here, I found another 135 that were built but during the time frame called Wickford their home port. So now we have a place that's all about pleasure boats, but in the 17 and 1800s it was about maritime trade, industry, and fishing. And giant sailboats of massive size would be able to come in and out of Wickford Harbor because of the reality that it was a natural deep flushing port. The channel itself flushed out on every high and low tide, stayed deep, no dredging was required until the seawall was constructed after the 1954 hurricane. After the shipyard closed at the end of the beginning of the Civil War, the area down here, just to the south of us here, was then brought in as a major coal importing port, and coal was brought into Wickford Harbor on a regular basis to fuel the textile mills, to fuel the Seaview trolley line, and eventually to fuel the new coal-fired stoves that were in people's homes all along the way. The Seaview trolley line eventually built a spur line that came right down from Elam Street and came right down here to the end of where we can see this building along the waterfront, and loaded coal right from the ships and hauled it up and down the Seaview trolley line to supply coal to the trolley line, to power plants in Narragansett, power plants in East Greenwich, and power plants in Hamilton, which run the Seaview trolley line. And of course, if we think about it now, all this coal being Wickford, all of Wickford would have been covered in coal dust. But the people in Wickford in the 1870s didn't feel bad about it. They looked at the coal dust as being something that talked about industry, talked about prosperity, and talked about jobs. And also talked about changing the old homes that were still being heated by wood stoves and wood fireplaces over to modern coal heating stoves and modern coal heating furnaces. So again, there was industry in Wickford. Coal continued to come into Wickford until the 1930s and 1940s, and were all offloaded at that location there. From here, we're going to head off to the end of Main Street by the town dock. Okay, this is another shipyard site. The Holloway family, which was a very early family in Wickford, ran a shipyard all the way along the shoreline here and built medium-sized schooners and brigs that were really, if you think about these boats, I like to call them the 18-wheelers of the 18th century, because goods were being moved by sea, and that's why Wickford did so well. I mean, there were no real road networks. At this time, there was no trains. If you wanted to move goods up and down the eastern seaboard to all the colonies, and then as they became states, you needed to use the water side and go up and down the eastern seaboard. And the Holloway family were one of the families that were building these medium-sized ships that were perfect for doing that, just running up and down the eastern seaboard. They were called coastwise schooners for the most part, and that's what they did. They worked hard just like an 18-wheeler ship. They had a short life because they took a pounding going around Cape Hatteras, etc., and they would last 10 or 12 years. So it was a great market for families like the Holloways, because every 10 or 12 years their customers would be coming back for a new vessel because it had taken a beating and it was done from going back and forth. So the Holloway family worked in this location making those kind of vessels here for literally decades and decades. Across the way there we have the town dock, and it's been just like it is pretty much since that 1710 time frame, albeit a little bit smaller as it's been filled in and made larger over the years. But this was a center at the beginning of Wickford where ships would come and go, bringing in goods and hauling out goods. There was not a whole bunch of stuff that went out of Wickford Harbor. Particularly it was agricultural goods, particularly during the Narragansett planter time frame when they were running giant farms. And when I talk about giant, as I said, the Updikes had about 1,600 acres of land. The Robinsons, who are down by where the Ori Bay campus, a part of this whole group, 2,700 acres of land. And all of them were in this agribusiness. They weren't just farms. These were agribusinesses working along with traders in Newport and the British government back in London to supply foodstuffs and agricultural products and livestock for the sugar plantations on the Caribbean islands. It's pretty amazing to think about the fact that South County, Rhode Island was really the breadbasket for the Caribbean. The British were making so much money on sugarcane, they didn't want to waste an acre in any of these islands to grow hay, fodder, corn, or to have pasture land. Every bit of it was planted in sugarcane, which were managed by slave labor, and Wickford supplied all the food for that. It's really quite amazing how that all worked out. Indeed, the 10-rod road, which we all know, and it's an oddball name for the road, a strange road that goes from eastern Connecticut to Wickford. You know, you wouldn't think in the 1700s that would really be very important. But the 10-rod road was designed in that time frame as a livestock drover's turnpike. So people in western Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut who had excess livestock could bring them down to Wickford and sell them to livestock brokers, and they could be loaded on vessels right here at the town dock and taken maybe to Baltimore or New York or to the Caribbean, where they would then be butchered. So Wickford was a busy, busy place at that time frame. The other thing that occurred at the town dock was the triangle trade. I'm sure we've all heard of the triangle trade, which has to do with an ugly business that involved three profitable commodities. One was good Rhode Island rum, the best rum in the world according to anybody in the 1700s. The other was molasses, and the third was slaves. And these three commodities were brought and sold from the Narragansett Bay over to West Africa, back to the Caribbean, and back to the Narragansett Bay. And the triangle existed because rum was a commodity that they could make money. They could take the money or trade it directly to West African chieftains for people that had conquered as for slaves. The slaves were loaded on a ship, taken to the Caribbean so they could work in those sugar plantations for the British, offloaded there, sold and bartered for molasses. Molasses came back up to the Narragansett Bay, and molasses is the prime ingredient in making rum in the 1700s and 1800s. The triangle was complete, and it was an ugly business, but if you were sitting here on the dock here in Wickford, you'd see a boat go off with barrels of rum and come back with barrels of molasses, and you wouldn't even realize what was on that other ugly passage that went from West Africa to the Caribbean. Across the way, we see the existing Wickford shipyard. This existing Wickford shipyard in the 1870s was the terminus for another train line that ran in Wickford. We had the Seaview Trolley line we talked about that began in 1890. In 1870, the Newport and Wickford rail and steamship line was established that ran from the train station up at Wickford Junction, where Walmart is now, down through the woods, all the way down Poplar Point, and ended right at the very end where the last of these big boat storage building is. This was owned primarily by rich Newporters who hated the idea of having to get off a boat or a train in Providence and in the very industrial mess that they created and what caused them their wealth. They didn't like the dirtiness of it. They didn't like the fact that it was loaded with immigrant people who they didn't understand. They wanted a nice, neat, clean way to get to Newport, to get to those wonderful summer cottages they had over there, like the Breakers and Marble House. So Cornelius Vanderbilt himself was the primary financier for the Newport and Wickford rail and steamship line. He was a smart man, though. He was connected in the government, and in order to finance it and make it work for him financially, he got the mail contract for all the mail for South County, Rhode Island, Newport County, and southeastern Massachusetts. And it was all run on the trains that he owned and on the 3 different ferry boats over time that ran out of that dock. Everybody who was anybody in the Gilded Age of Newport had to come to Wickford to get there. Rockefellers would be walking down the streets. The Vanderbilts would be walking down the streets. The Berwins would be walking down the streets. Everybody who was anybody came to Wickford. And really, this is the story of why we have the Wickford we have today. Because in the 1870s through the 1890s, these rich folks were coming here. They were walking around the village. They saw this place as a real estate bonanza. As I said, the Civil War ended the shipbuilding industry here, and we had giant houses that used to be owned by wealthy people connected to the maritime trade. Think about Main Street in Wickford. Is there a poor person house anywhere that you can think of? No. Wickford was a center of prosperity until the Civil War and the advent of modern, reliable rail destroyed the industry that had made it so wealthy. So these giant houses were sitting here, and if you're in the next social strata below the Astors and the Berwins and the Vanderbilts, you would like to be able to come over and take advantage of the social life in Newport from the 1870s to the 1920s. Those great parties, all the things that were going on there, but you can't afford one of those houses. But you could come to Wickford and buy one of these beautiful houses and restore it completely, live here in Wickford on the cheap, only come down here in the summer, and the vast majority of Wickford homes in that time frame were summer houses for wealthy people whose lives were in Newport. But they put the money in and restored every house in Wickford. In that 50-year period, every house in Wickford was restored by a seasonal person who came here to get on that ferry boat, which ran to Newport at its peak 12 or 15 times a day. From 6 in the morning till midnight, that ferry boat ran, and it brought Wickford back to life and gave us the Wickford we have today. Without that, Wickford would look like Warwick. It would look like East Greenwich because the houses were impossible to maintain, expensive to restore. But these folks had all the money in the world in the age long before income tax, and they did the work for us. And we have them to thank for the Wickford we have today. All of these houses were restored in that 50-year critical period when most of them were a century or older and were falling into disrepair. So these folks who came into Wickford to get on that ferry boat over there saved the village. And that little train that Cornelius Vanderbilt, not a guy I'd like to brag about in the most part because he was obviously a rapacious businessman during the time frame, but he did one good thing for Wickford in paying for that rail line and getting jobs and getting folks with big money to come into the village and restore all of our homes. So if you live in a house in Wickford, you go back in your history and you owe it to some rich guy who was coming here just to go and spend some time at the Breakers at a party. And that's a reality, and it's a great story, one of the great stories that we have here in Wickford. So now we'll get out of our huddle here and head down, go on the other side and end up at the end of Pleasant Street, where we'll have our last stop.
So Tim, before we pull out, I was noticing that little house that we can see over there, pink with the purple roof.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the neighbors who live here and have been here for many years put that house out there. There's a family of ducks who come back every year and live in that house. That's just something that the same people put out in the harbor to enjoy it. And you also see a nice whale's tail here that they have at the end of their dock. It's just like outside art that we have here in the village, benefit of folks who really love the place. All right, for those who haven't been out here, this is at this point called Cornelius Island. It's an interesting place for a number of reasons. First and foremost, in 25 years of me researching the history of Wickford, I still don't know why it's called Cornelius Island. So that's one of the big mysteries of Wickford. And the second thing about Cornelius Island that is also interesting is it did not begin its life as an island. Like so many other locations in Wickford, it was a peninsula, a point of land that jutted out into the ocean and became a very valuable place in the 17 and 1800s for people to pasture livestock. If you think about livestock and keeping them in one place, not getting them to wander off, you think about a peninsula, it makes perfect sense. All you've got to do is wall off the one end of the peninsula, and the remainder of it is surrounded by water. And that's what Cornelius Island was for quite some time, along with places like Calf Pasture Point, which is named after the fact that that's what it was all about, and other peninsulas around the area, particularly in the colonial period, where folks would have their livestock and keep them protected from wandering off and getting lost or eaten by predators by having just a small area of land at the end of the peninsula that they would have to wall off. But in the 1840s, it appears, one of the farmers who was using this land for a peninsula was maybe lazy, I don't know. He got this great idea. He saw that the end of the end of Cornelius Island, that peninsula, was fairly narrow, and he trenched across it to make a little bridge so the sheep or whatever he was pasturing on here would not wander off. He made it into an island, but he had a small bridge you could walk across. The trouble was that the storms that come up, the nor'easters, eroded that little channel that he created to keep his sheep or cows from wandering off and cut it so largely that it then became an island. So Cornelius Island, which began as a peninsula, ends up as an island due to this farmer being a little lazy and didn't want to maintain his stone walls. It's an interesting place in and of itself in that it has some great stories. And the first comes back to an industry that went along here in Wickford that was kind of a partner industry to the fishing industry, which was very important in Wickford from the 1850s, actually until the present day. We went around a number of fishing boats. A company from Fall River, Massachusetts came down and bought the Cornelius Island from the owner at that time and opened up a company here. It was called the Wickford Guano and Fertilizer Company. And they made products here on Cornelius Island. The ruins of buildings that are on Cornelius Island go back to that day. What they did is they bought menhaden, which was a fish that was used for oil, from fishermen in the Narragansett Bay, and then junk fish, bycatch that folks were catching and didn't want to haul. Cod fishermen who caught something they couldn't sell, they bring it all here, and they would take the fish and run them through presses and press out the oil and put the oil in casks and barrels and sell it off. It was poor man's whale oil. It could be sold to light your houses. Didn't make your house smell as good as whale oil, but it worked. And also it was being used in the beginnings of the steel industry for annealing steel. They were using fish oil in that process. So that little industry went on here for quite a while. The folks who ran it got a little bit more ingenious in that they saw afterwards they had mountains of pressed fish guts piled up here on Cornelius Island after they pressed all the oils out of it. They leave them out here in the sun to dry out and kind of break down in the sun. So what they did in that time frame was then they hired locals who were sometimes folks who were fishing along the shoreline or young boys to bring seaweed in and also guano, which of course guano is bird poop. which they'd scrape off the beaches and off the rocks and bring it in, and they take the fish guts and mix it with the seaweed and the guano and end up with a natural fertilizer product that they would sell each spring and each fall to farmers in the area. And as I mentioned, by 1870, Wickford is a place of prosperity again. Folks that were going to Newport were here, and every spring and every fall, wagons had come across from Camp Avenue across that channel that the farmer made, and they would load up their wagons, all these farmers from North Kingstown, Exeter, Coventry, West Greenwich, with this natural fertilizer product that they'd spread on the fields. And then they'd ride all these wagons full of this disgusting mix out across the town of North Kingstown. The whole place reeked of this stuff. And eventually in the 1890s, the people in Wickford had had enough, and they came to the financial town meeting. It looked like a scene from an old Frankenstein movie from what I've read. They had pitchforks. Everybody was angry. They wanted this business closed down. The newspaper accounts call it the most noxious, horrible business that's ever existed in Rhode Island because it was stinking up the entire community. The town sergeant, the town marshal, was sent over to the island, and after a vote by the town council, this long-standing business was told that they had to shut down. And most of the folks who lived here and worked in the fish oil and guano plant went back to Fall River to the parent company that was doing it over there. A few of the families stayed on, including a family called the Masons, who were living on Pleasant Street. And eventually the Masons bought Cornelius Island and held on to it until the present day. Descendants of the Mason family still own half of Cornelius Island, and the other half is owned by the state of Rhode Island as part of the Island Park system. So it's had a long and interesting history, and it's quite a place. Great place to explore if you do come out kayaking. Your only concern here is to check yourself for ticks. It is a tick magnet, this place, but it's a great place to look at, a great place to explore for kayakers and canoers and the like. Now, across the way where we see the Wickford Yacht Club and the Pleasant Street Wharf is the first places that shipyards were constructed. In 1710, Samuel Aborn came here from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Henry Vaughan and Benjamin Waterhouse came here from the Newport area and set up their shipyards. Shipyards were located at that location, 2 shipyards, for decades. But in the 1880s, the shipyards again were closed. Those locations were available, and they were purchased for the beginnings of aquaculture in the Narragansett Bay. And it kind of is interesting because it ties to what goes on now. 2 oyster companies opened up there and used Narragansett Bay and Wickford Harbor for oyster farming, just like they do with oyster farming today. Wickford oysters were the most popular oysters up and down the eastern seaboard, and these 2 companies, Seacoast Oyster and the Wickford Oyster Company, made millions. And if we were here in the 1920s or 30s, we would see a pile of oyster shells from the canning operation and shucking operation as tall as those buildings. That's how many oysters that they were hauling out of the Wickford Harbor and utilized in industry. It was the #1 employer in Wickford for a number of decades until 1938, when the oyster industry got hit by the double whammy of the 38 hurricane, and then the Navy coming in to dredge the Narragansett Bay for the construction of Quonset-Davisville. So a long sort of history there on that dock, going from 1710 till today, of maritime-related industry occurring there. And finally, around this other side of Cornelius Island is an island that is now called Rabbit Island, which is an interesting misnomer. It was originally called Babbitt Island, and some map maker decided he didn't believe it was called Babbitt Island, so he wrote Rabbit Island on it, and it stuck that way. Prior to that, it was known as the Queen's Island, going back to the time of Roger Williams, when the Queen's, Chief Sachem's wife here in the area of Wickford, Canonicus's wife, gave the island to Roger Williams because she couldn't stand having the livestock that Roger Williams brought here to live here, roaming around in her gardens. It too is a great place to pull out in a kayak and explore. I just hope you all enjoyed it. I know we'll probably all be ready to head out, but please take advantage of the kayaks and the beautiful Wickford Harbor this summer. We may do this again. We'll see, and if you have interest or other friends, keep an eye on the Kayak Center website, and we'll be posting it. Yeah, it was great fun. You're a great group.